Just as the Cyclops or Centaur is known worldwide as representative of Greek mythology, it's sometimes said that the most internationally recognized Slavic myth must be the vampire, but very often people seem unaware of the tremendous differences between the original mythological phenomena versus the shadow of Western literary traditions. Much ink has been spilt across the Western tradition pertaining to immortal monsters who are damned to drink blood, who lack reflections, who shapeshift into bats, who burn in daylight and stalk by night, who are usually wealthy and romantic scoundrels, or wise but scheming and monstrous lords or nobility. Not a single attribute which has just been listed could accurately, holistically be applied to the archaic Slavic vampire, and unfortunately Western attempts to rediscover an Eastern European folkloric vampire tend to be even less accurate and spread even more misinformation about these customs. The Western rendition of the vampire had first emerged under Austro-Hungarian political bureaucracy. As Austrian officials observed folk customs of the Slavs in their domain, they began cataloging folkloric accounts among the Serbs to Macedonians, and similar customs in Romania and Hungary, and they then applied their newly created, distilled, and oversimplified idea of the vampire to the folklore they learned from Poland, Russia, across Eastern Europe. And once the Habsburgs collected a wide diversity of spirits under an umbrella of vampire, they then tried to ban folkloric belief in vampirism, ordering the destruction of multitudes of folk customs, whether the locals called their spirits vampir or not. As the Western Church propagated their version of the vampire, their populations subsequently underwent mass hysteria. Random Western citizens spent a few years reporting and gossiping about new vampires, quite unlike old Eastern traditions, forming new types of creatures, which in turn became unpopular within a few decades, and then were eventually picked up by Western authors as literary characters. As the trend exploded for a few decades, only to disappear and finally become immortalized as strict fiction to the West. Within the countryside villages and occasionally the cities of Eastern Europe, the spirit endured as it had before. Where exactly the vampire came from remains hotly debated by scholars, but their earliest record comes centuries before the Western hysteria, written between 1000 and 1300 within the commentary on the Sermon of St. Gregory, in the form of localization advice for preaching to Slavs. Errant word reached the Slavs, and they began to offer sacrifices to Rod and Rossi before Perun, their god, and earlier they offered sacrifices to Upiory and Berginas, but even now, on the outskirts, they pray to him, the cursed god Perun, and to Kors and Mokosh, and to the Vilas. They do this in secret. In the sermon, the passage Gods and Sacrifices and Idols and Demons, which in Greek referenced the daimons, in Old Slavic was changed to Upiory, and this Upiory, as we will discuss later, can for now be simplified as a relative spirit to vampire. Its history before that gets convoluted. Various authors suggested that the Slavs learned of the spirit from Hungarians or Romanians, or even more distantly from ancient Iranic nations of the Pontic steppe, or perhaps it arose fully indigenously to the Slavs and only happened to resemble concepts found among neighbors, since, after all, almost every culture on Earth tells stories of restless, cannibalistic demons. Regardless of where it might originate in the distant past, the name made by the Slavs pertains to specific sets of superstitions and traits, so to stay on track, we'll focus only on the Slavic phenomenon. While a few authors have proposed epidemic cholera or the Great Black Death as the origin to the vampire, the sermon predates Black Death in Eastern Europe by decades to centuries, depending on specific region, and pandemic cholera by 400 400 to 500 years. Likewise, while porphyria has often been credited as the vampire's origin due to weakness to sunlight which causes burning skin, many of these traits were once rare to the vampire, becoming added or exaggerated by Western authors. So this is a red herring which can only really imply what might have inspired certain Western authors to inject new ideas into their literary versions. Now, rather than any one sickness, it seems the vampire came from the vast pantheon of Eastern European folk spirits, and like all the others, it would situationally be attributed to countless tragedies which might befall a specific village. In this, the vampire is similar in function to the many demons of winter who follow around the devil, collectively called the Dark Ones or Ugly Ones, composed of many types of demons who also possess individual names and identities. In much the same way, vampire, verbatim, should be understood more as a category or family of spirits in modern usage, rather than any one specific spirit. And in the last 2 centuries, Slavs have observed the mutation of their folklore by other countries. So in Slavic languages today, the very same word is often used in 2 very different categories of being. One of them still lives in the superstitions and folk religions of the countryside, as an authentic part of folkloric religion. The other is a complete fiction, often deconstructing and reimagining Western vampire tropes into further works of art. Scholarship has long observed this phenomena, but also struggled to describe it. To paraphrase scholar Jaroslav Kolchinsky, every attempt to isolate a figure as either folkloric or modern must be inevitably arbitrary. The two are simply now intertwined, and any concept of an original vampire is inherently modern or retrospective. These spirits were diverse down to the village. The concept of vampire was never unified until it was unified by the pressure of an outside force. In speaking on superstitions of the countrysiders, ethnographer Kazimierz Morzyński wrote, even in the 1930s, the notable heartland of vampirism was, and is still up to today, located in the basin of the lower Vistula. Whatever Slavs claim about these half-demonic creatures, it is filled with unrestrained savagery. Similarly, in the late 1800s, as the West struggled to understand their trends of vampirism, Polish scholars attempted to explain their nature as native to and reflective of Eastern European cultures. Not a trend, but something which persisted through that half of the continent over the centuries, because it somehow resonated to some truth within the culture, though what exactly that truth is was and remains esoterically subjective and controversial to try to pinpoint. Elaborating on the perseverance of vampire superstition into the modern era, contemporary folkloric scholar Czesław Robotyski explains extensively, here paraphrased just for brevity. It is ethnographic fact. Folklorists and ethnographers will attest the fact that rumors of the vampire still sometimes circulate between the people of Poland, usually attributed to especially violent or unusual murders. Those I know best happened in southern Poland, such as rumors from Kraków about a vampire who terrorized the city through January and February. People insisted their informants were doctors or soldiers, the respectable authorities. I most enjoyed when my folklorist colleagues told me such stories with an authentic passion. In this time, 30 attacks were attributed to the vampire, or a group of them. All the victims were lured by the cry of a baby or a scream, or were grabbed when they were alone, and were all beaten and were killed most horribly and viciously. The attacker wore all white. His face was pale or blurry. There were survivors, but everyone who had escaped him also had lost their memory or had it altered. I had only seen one of these published, an article about a murdered girl in February, but this was far into the rumors about these attacks. And so the ethnographer describes many other superstitions of vampire attacks across the previous 50 or 60 years, while the object of his paper is to understand the intertwining between ancient and modern. While a few occurrences could be traced back to Old Faith or village customs, the majority share of vampire incidents reported today are reported alongside times when a particular novel or film about vampires gets released or becomes popular. Many also surge during times of economic and political stress. So the author cautions that while there is a diversity of folkloric vampyry, most modern rumors are products of lightning-fast modern methods of communication, with one foot in Polish culture and the other in the mentalities of chain emails and true crime urban legends. So this phenomena should not be directly conflated as identical to the old traditions, but also cannot be fully divorced from their culture of birth. They are something new, yet something native to a culture. As people continue telling stories, strict categories only become more futile. But following the paths of these stories and where they emerge from can help us understand a lot about them. In short, just because a vampire story comes from Poland does not mean it's necessarily what we're looking for when we indicate a folkloric vampire. That there are stories from the modern day which are continuities of the old, along with stories which are rather new and many which are a combination. One creature might hold one name in one village and another in another, or two spirits with very different attributes might happen to share one common name. There are dozens of names attributed to hundreds of spirits, which all interconnect due to similarity, so they might all cautiously be called vampire-like, but not all are literally the original spirit who was first named a vampire. Also remember the reverse, that names which sometimes apply to vampire-like spirits also sometimes apply to spirits, which are nothing like Wampiry. Indeed, this most generic name Vampyr was probably brought to Poland, probably loaned from the South Slavs, but imposed and spread by German church officials, and then sometime localized back into folklore. Thus, the not uncommon perception that the word vampire came from the Germans into Poland. In Polish, the word vampire is simply imprecise. Due to its imprecision, it has limited application as an umbrella term which did not originally exist in the language. The great multitude of names for these spirits derive from folk superstition. Many Slavs traditionally believe that the speaking of words or names will evoke a type of magic sent from your soul, carried by your breath and words, and that soul of your breath might be consumed by certain malevolent spirits, while others might simply follow the projected trail of spoken word back to the speaker, thus attacking them after speaking their name. Through this belief, dozens of names for vampire-like spirits within highly specific folktales or songs from individual villages are, in everyday language, replaced with the less specific, and so less dangerous names. But to be clear, while these common names are somewhat safer, they still should not be taken lightly or be used recklessly. No words you speak, especially not names, should ever be used lightly. Every word you speak has a life of its own. And in an opposite phenomena, these names can develop secondary application with a generic concept. For example, the Upiory might be one specific demon from a few villages, or the broader name for a dozen distinct spirits across Poland, or a generic innuendo as vague as English's ghost or phantom. To some extent, these words became so widely applicable in an effort to depower their dangerous nature, but in speaking about the original spirits, the superstition about the magical danger of names can still return. And as we discuss the perseverance of superstitions, I would like to take a moment to reply to a YouTuber who I've generally greatly enjoyed the work of. Examples can be an excellent tool to learn, and I found his recent video about vampires to be lackluster and overly restricted to archaeological digs at the expense of living ethnography. Mini Minuteman spends his video about vampires discussing medieval vampire graves, mostly focusing focusing on the West, but I also thank him for his mention that Wampiry came from Eastern Europe, though I will also repeat concerns about some of the data that he looked at in these videos, echoing concerns shared by Polish ethnographers and scientists before, that Western researchers tend to lump any suspicious grave in Poland as a vampire grave, when in actuality we don't necessarily know if that grave was a vampire or some other type of demon or spirit, because there are very, very many. But the way that archaeological sites are discussed could be an entire video on their own, and I would like to remain focused. After discussing archaic instances, Milo Rossi builds to a particular conclusion.
Today, people are not accused of being vampires. We can sit in our living room couches or on our bus ride home from school and look at memes about them,
New York City,
and TV shows about them, or read a book about them. They can be funny, they can be a little bit scary, they can be sexy, they can be super gay, but if there's one thing that they aren't, it's real. Now, you could easily say that at the time these burials happened, vampires weren't real then either. But they may as well have been, because they dictated the way that people actually lived their lives. The actions that people took at this time were done with the understanding that vampires were a very real threat. So even if vampires didn't really exist then, does it really matter if people acted as though they did? So what changed? As time went on, many of the superstitions that would make people accuse others of vampirism began to be more understood. Things like germ theory were discovered, unlocking the wonderful and horrifying world of biological diseases. Once we knew what germs and bacteria and plagues were, we did not need to pin things on vampires and the dead. Along with this, science made great strides in understanding death, what happens to a body post-mortem, and that many of the unusual phenomena once attributed to vampires are just a natural part of the decomposition process. In fields like natural science, disasters were understood more. Droughts, tornadoes, floods, and hurricanes all began to be understood as natural phenomena not attributed to the supernatural. And so yet again, the use for vampires faded into obscurity. By the 1800s, the scientific revolution had really found its stride, and with it, it drove the final proverbial stake through the heart of the vampire myth. With so much of a better understanding of the world that we live in, we no longer had need for these baseless superstitions. And so the fear of the dead rising and wreaking havoc among the living, a superstition which had existed for literally thousands of years, finally came to an end. And so these creatures finally became endearing characters of pop culture rather than vicious demonic entities. But the superstition around vampires hasn't been entirely laid to rest. In 2004 in Romania, a family member of a recently deceased man was complaining of having horrible nightmares, visions and hallucinations of him rising and wreaking havoc on the world of the living. In response to this, the man's body was exhumed from the town's cemetery. First, a stake was driven through his heart, and then his heart was removed. After this, his heart was burned to ash and made into a potion in order to cure the family members who had been suffering from these hallucinations. I will highlight again, this was in 2004. Fear of the unknown will drive people to do outlandish things, and this is why it's so important for us to understand the world around us. With every scientific advancement and discovery, we get a little bit closer to knowing.
Apologies, Milo, and all due respect, I'm sure that you're a great archaeologist, but this segment makes it clear that you probably encountered this burial as a news headline rather than as an ethnographic datum in a published literature. So I feel an obligation to correct your conduct here, even though you'll probably never see this video, because I know that you agree fundamentally that correcting misinformation is important. Wampiry within Eastern Europe were not an element of mass hysteria the way they were in Western Europe. They were, and still are, an enduring mainstay of folk religious traditions, and their vanishing in the modern day has nothing to do with scientific discovery, but rather to do with the disappearances of village-level religion as a whole, as industrialization slowly drives urbanization, and so hegemony with an atheistic worldview. The people who still claim to encounter these spirits are believers in a religious practice, not too different than the changes to diet and abstaining from certain pleasantries which come with Lent around this time of year. There was no scientific misunderstanding which caused these encounters and burials. They're only driven by faith. Not every religious custom emerges from a simple scientific source. Even if you don't believe in spiritual beings, the sociological phenomena that interconnect to create these are simply far more complicated than these singular material sources which pop history so often search for. And so to dismiss this religious custom without understanding its source in the folk religion and the ethnographic context is a disservice to the intersectional nature of anthropology, and a lesson in the danger of prioritizing material archaeology over research into the living cultures. Said another way, belief in Wampiry persists because the faith in the superstition is self-perpetuating, not unlike Western belief in the ghosts of dead people haunting old houses, or the Arabic world's enduring faith in the jinn, or Japan's own enduring belief in the yokai. Just because your own experiences make the cultural belief in Wampiry difficult to understand or seem especially strange, doesn't make the traditional belief any more backwards or irrational or based in misunderstanding than your aunt's belief in guardian angels and the saints displayed on her coffee table. We are here to learn and observe. We are not here to condemn or to make value judgments or assumptions about the origins of superstitions. The extreme regionality of the natures of these spirits intertwines with continued respect for them, even if not wholeheartedly literally believed in. Many ethnographers and elders who record their stories do so out of a respect for the wisdoms contained within the story, be they metaphorical, allegorical, or simply true. The most detailed and passionate stories are perpetuated out of some variety of respect, not just as mere entertainment. Think of the oral tales as less similar to creepypastas and closer to stories that might run in your family, maybe about the way your grandparents met and fell in love. Stories that happened so long ago that the warping of emotion and time have bled details together to make the invented, the fictional, and the authentic be totally inseparable. The greatest certainty is how little can be proven with certainty. There come to be countless iterations of one story. Not everyone believes the story, but those who do treat them most seriously. Nowhere is better to begin than the context in which the vampire functions. In the majority of Slavic folk religion, there are two distinct souls, or two components of the soul, which both inhabit a person's body. One soul is the life force, which also flows through all living children of God. The other soul resembles or contains the personality, or individual, which determines the person which you are. And at death, the life force will return to nature, and the person's soul will travel to the afterlife. So said as simply as possible, the vampire is a spirit which must feed off the life force of another, due to the deformity or absence of their own. This feeding off of life force can often be represented by bloodletting and drinking of blood, especially in the East, but can just as often appear as crushing or strangling of the soul, or lingering in shadows and leeching off of the soul without harming the body directly, or as ripping the body to bits in hunger for soulful flesh. The life force soul will be the fixation of the vampire's hunger, and the persistence of some terrible and distorted personality soul within the vampire was the mechanism enabling its magic. Mostly they cast spells similar to sleepwalking, confusing their victim and scrambling their memory as they baited them away from the safety of the home and into the dark and swampy places of magic, where the demon would be most strong and its feeding would be effortless. Beyond this, the nature of how and why the spirit exists can taxonomically be sorted by two major perspectives. Both are widespread and heavily intertwined, both pertaining to the nature of that personal or individual soul which casts magic. In the first perspective, to some, vampire-like spirits are more literally similar to the black demons of winter, as an individual soul which was never human, that must latch onto a human body, living or dead, to give it strength and enable its hunt. So in this form, the vampire is technically the union between a human body and the black spirit within it. In contrast, others consider the personality soul to be originally human, possession. Essentially, the person's soul is touched by magic and then metamorphosed into a demonic soul because of the intensity of the suddenness and violence of whatever situation killed the person. This variety, created through tragedy, is heavily cognate to previously mentioned Slavic demons of the undead, who more generally terrorize or stalk people without the element of feeding off of their life force soul. Folklore overlaps and interconnects. Whichever of the variants, Wampiry are not alive and are not, or at least are no longer, connected to life force, which is why they must steal from another. Some villages say their bodies continue to decay as they would have, while others consider decomposition to be slowed or even stopped by the consumption of life soul, but this shouldn't be mistaken as immortality. Most obviously, whatever killed the body will scar the vampire, such as a stab wound to the chest. Likewise, all bodily functions cease, so the vampire cannot heal new wounds it suffers. It cannot digest or consume any food. As the body's waters dry up, they can no longer cry or sweat. Their struggle to salivate and speak is sometimes symbolized with frustrated chewing on the cloth they were buried in, and as they lose their hair, it will not grow back. This loss of hair ties into the weakness of their life force, which in folk religion often shows its strength through the health and length of hair, and the life force is often harnessed through magic by growing out hair and harnessing it into a braid. Along with their most common appearance as rather typical corpses displaying the traits of decomposition, two additional subtypes could be identified which often tie to some common behaviors. Some vampyr who were especially violent and animalistic in their hunting might go into nature and feed off and live alongside stray animal, and often these vampyr would become especially lean or malnourished with bright blood-red skin, the product both of their constant feeding staining them, and of the falling off of and the wearing thin of their skin due to roughhousing with or constantly fighting and feeding off of animals. As an opposite phenomena, sometimes other vampyri became gluttonous in feasting on blood and the life force itself, skulking in corners and gorging itself while remaining unnoticed. As their successful hunts continue, these vampyri will fill and bloat as their bodies fill with excess life force and blood, which they don't need to process, their undead equivalent to gaining weight. Their cheeks and forehead might blush red due to all the excess blood within them, and with strength from their fullness, these vampyri were especially likely to be those which actively physically fought the living rather than relying on sleep or bewitchment. While their swelling could be similar to the bloating stage of decomposition, the vampyr won't usually leak the black bile fluids which characterize the natural version. Quite similar, but such minor distinctions become important when graves were dug up and villages needed to differentiate between ordinary corpses and resting vampyri. Though it must be stressed that to some villages or regions, most or all vampyri fell into these forms. The more familiar corpsely forms so widespread across the Slavic West or Poland in general would become rare to some specific places. While it's still a diverse area, I do happen to find these two forms more often than the withered corpse in many places around Kraków. Likewise, my searches have found an abundance of vampyri with bright red or especially large and flappy ears in the vicinity of Kashubia, where their version of the spirit would actively read from books of prayers, which were items that would repel vampyri from other places. Listing the strange nuances and differences could go on for hours, but our main message here is the diversity of belief itself. Due to their frightening appearance as animated corpses, vampyri traveled mostly under nighttime's darkness, the lack of visibility acting as disguise. Some would spend daytime back in the graveyard or the site they died, where it was safest to hide, while others would set up residence within the home of their victim victims, oftentimes first in the attic or corners, or out in the barn until their victims were weakened enough to be confronted. While certain magical abilities of Wampiry might be weaker or broken by sunlight, very few folkloric Eastern Vampyri would burn or die in the sunlight. Instead, the magics of black demons are just universally weaker in daytime, so rather than burn in sunlight, they will likely slink away and rest in darkness to regain their magic for their next prowl during the next nighttime. We'll also underscore that vampire contagion, the passing of vampirism onto a victim, is not a true literal contagion in folklore. Rather, if a vampire has taken up residence in the corpse of your deceased loved one, either that vampire can intentionally kill other people in violent displays to encourage their souls to also become vampiric, or, like scavengers, the black souls might be drawn to an active vampire, watching it haunt its victims, and they might infest corpses to join in on the act of tragedy, like crows gathering over the body. Either way, the pop culture simplification that the bite of a vampire will inevitably turn others into vampyri like some sort of infection is horribly oversimplified, to the point of losing all the original context. At this point, my proofreader reminded me of a Western trope of two sharp fangs which vampires use to draw blood. This also has no solid basis in folklore. Vampyri bit in whichever way they managed or happened to, and while their teeth sometimes sharpened, every tooth was affected, not just two, sometimes along with the deterioration or loss of the entire lower jaw. This was all part of decomposition, since they very literally remained as walking corpses. If their cheeks or noses or eyelids or eyes also withered and distorted, this was all part of decomposition. Usually nothing to do with magical distortion of the features. They were walking corpses, and describing their appearance as corpses added to the story. I struggle to understand how this subtext was lost on 19th and 20th century writers. Their pretty ones are too pretty to be folkloric, but the monstrous tend to be far too exaggerated in the ways that it seems the artists were just unfamiliar with corpses and didn't realize the connection in the appearance. Similarly, sometimes Western superstition says that vampires grow their fingernails longer and longer as an indication of their immortality, but the tendency for finger flesh to shrink away after death to reveal more fingernail was well known before modern medicine. After all the wars and pandemics which struck Eastern Europe, looters understood that rings became easier to steal as hands shrunk. The mark of vampirism on the hands instead came through the sharpening and the mechanical wearing upon the nails, as their grasping against the coffin lid night after night would make their nails like talons, while embedding dirt and wood beneath them, which they often never cleaned due to their aversion for running water, causing the hands to dirty further each night. And while brown hemorrhaging under the middle or root of the nails is common for corpses, a fresh, bright red blood under their sharpened end of their nails was more often the concern which the vampire hunters searched for. Now, just as death is natural and the decomposition and rotting of bodies is natural, the vampire is a very natural member of folk cosmology, a spirit among many spirits which is part of natural cycles of decay and renewal. In a folktale from Ukraine recorded in the 1800s, the lady spirit who embodies plague had been terrorizing the lands of Ukraine for a long time, when a nobleman encountered a vampire-type spirit who informed him that they came to chase away the plague, that the plague was a sister to the vampire-like spirit, and it requested that the man help it gather supplies. At the end of the tale, the vampiric spirit chased the plague away, but in return took the lives of everyone the nobleman knew, only sparing him as it took them all in a single night. This tale has been widely misunderstood. Writers less versed in folklore have used it to argue that the vampire-like spirit represented a major disease disease, just as its sister the plague had, but this misses critical context. Across much Slavic folklore, the major pandemic diseases of Black Plague, tuberculosis, and often either typhus or cholera have long been embodied as terrifying goddesses, the three sisters of the plagues. Likewise, sicknesses like cattlepox were often explicitly connected to other particular demons. Likewise, common colds and flu to their own, but there is no specific disease which is identified directly to the vampire-like spirit in this story or in most, so it probably doesn't represent a specific disease. It more likely represents a broader concept such as tragic death or death in war or similar. Regardless of its meaning in this tale, the vampire-like spirit is in opposition to the plague, but is still a demon of misfortune, which brings death, a part of the cycles of decay and hardship. This is in harmony with the oldest account of the spirit, as one of many demons of the natural world. Because of this, the vampire-like spirit is often implied to be a type of inevitable, a fact of folkloric cosmology, which must be avoided and should never be invited, but is nothing to be defeated or destroyed in a final sense. It is not a monster story to triumph over, but rather a hardship to survive. They only step beyond their purpose in nature if they intrude into the home or take bodies from the dead, leaving their domain of the graveyard and the low, dark places and entering the domain of humans to feed on them. And in this, they intrude out of their sphere of wilderness and become vulnerable to the justice of God in restoring order, which is why, like so many black demons, they often fear rain and thunder and roosters as instruments and bodies of God, or once as Perun. But as to whether any human-like personality persists authentically in the vampire might be the most disuniform aspect of their soul. After either the human's soul turns vampiric or the body is taken by the demon, at the stage when the body is dead and inhabited by the darkness, is anything left of the person who was. Sometimes, in the most fortunate cases, the soul of the individual might manage to move on to the path for the afterlife, leaving its body to be ransacked like an abandoned house. These cases where the soul of the individual person could move on and the body only was left to the demon were often the least distressing, since no life remained in the eyes or the voice of the demon. It may have animated and desecrated the remains of a loved one, but at least it did not act anything like them. In other cases, the black demon feeds on and suppresses what is left of the person's soul, and dispatching of the demon in these cases is necessary to free the person and put them to rest. But these Wampiry gain some level of access to the memories or thoughts of the dead, so the targeting of their living family is incredibly common, and they use what they can access to torment them. The great distress of being haunted and pursued by the face and voice of the victim's deceased family member is the most horrific tool for such demons. Lastly, if the personality soul metamorphosed into the vampiric soul, they're often bound by a primary unfinished business, be it seeking revenge, or a lover who swore they'd return from war but died on the battlefield. Therefore, the degree to which the old personality remains will vary from village to village and case to case. In some tales from Czechia come a few vampires who retained their identity strongly enough to choose not to attack their families, and instead seek somewhat ethical alternatives. But a majority of Polish cases see the vampire lose themselves to their new instincts. Nonetheless, they still remember who they used to be. They still possess the same voice and face. Shadows of their old values and beliefs remain, which all leaves the question: if it remembers when it was your father, if it speaks the same way your father spoke, if the same soul animates its body, then isn't the vampire still your father? Is his change in priorities and turning against his family that cosmologically different than when families turn against each other due to political political or religious animosity? There's no simple, universal answer to this, but that same ambiguity and uncertainty in the personhood and identity of the horror haunting the family is exactly what made the vampiric demon so dreaded and feared. To be pursued by such a demon is to torture your grief and manipulate your love of your family, to break your heart and then consume your soul. Such a terrible fate. It's no wonder this pain and suffering could so easily turn the victims into these anguished demons themselves. And not uncommonly, this ended in the destruction of the entire extended family. An intrinsic aspect of the vampire relies on the close-knit family structures of rural Eastern Europeans. It touches on a primordial nerve of culture and society, far beyond any simple animal fear of just blood or death. In addition to the drinking of blood or lurking in the shadows of the family home, one additional method which a vampire might take to feed on the life force arises through that other sphere in which life force flows so strongly. While very rare in Poland, sometimes the vampire would force itself upon or use its dreamlike hypnotic powers to seduce either the person who was their lover in life or someone whom they lusted after in life. And quite contrary to modern tropes, this occasion, especially in Poland, can only be described as assault, and a feeding which would often take the life of the woman. While in other Slavic regions, this could sometimes be somewhat more consensual or result in a child, but any child resulting of a vampire in Poland would, if possible at all, suffer terrible birth defects, including a complete inability to stand or survive through infancy due to the fact that it lacked bones, or it lacked blood or bile, or many of the things which Wampiry cannot produce. In the Balkans, such children of vampires would not be burdened by the curses of their parent. They would not need to drink blood or consume life force, and they could eat normal food and go about fairly normal lives, instead only possessing magical abilities such as the skill to see invisible vampires when most people cannot. In all cases, the vampire takes control of a deceased body, but there has sometimes been confusion over this, and the final greatly misunderstood variety of the spirit is that of the born vampire, the situation in which a person can be identified from birth or a young age as reserved to be an eventual vessel for a demon. Those children who are born already with the demon latched onto their soul. This situation is rarely to never comparable to the false children left by the goddess hags, or their cognate superstition of Western changelings. No, the child marked by the vampire is a fully human child like any other, at least from the perspective of the soul. So any deformities which might arise on the body are caused by the parasitic demon which latches onto and resides inside of the child, much like insects which burrow deep into the fruit but leave markings and bruises that betray this infestation. These warning signs of the born vampire have varied incredibly widely, encompassing scores to hundreds of symptoms, but some of the most frequent include the presence of a secondary heart for the demon within, which was thought to be indicated by irregular or unusual heartbeats and breathing, or the child being born within a caul, something I'm not sure I can show on YouTube, so basically an extra membrane, which a child is sometimes born in, like a soft, flexible eggshell, which interestingly could be seen as a blessing from the mother or as a trace of the Wampiry, depending on the region and on the specific context. Also those people who had 2 layers of teeth doubling up, which is a real but rare medical issue, and those who are born totally without hair, which is also real but rare. Babies born with teeth already showing had the premature teeth removed and often made into a potion or talisman. Usually the parents did this to keep the vampire inside from taking over their child prematurely. The taking over of the child would likely be unavoidable, but with effort they could force the demon to wait until the child lived a full life and greeted a natural death. In a few places, such children were punished and abused for the telltale signs of the demon within, but this treatment was not as common as pop culture now sometimes suggests, since logically the harming of the child would do nothing to depower the demon who rested deep within them, and the death of the child would only bring the vampire out of hiding. Ultimately, the child was a victim of an inevitable misfortune, not an evil which had to be corrected. Alongside the image of the child with a dormant vampire within, 3 other scenes are near universally present in Polish folklore, exemplifying their nature, 2 of them so opposite, and a third a near-perfect microcosm of all their natures. So no discussion of the Polish vampire would be complete without the following. Sometimes the vampire, overcome with immense hunger, crawled from its grave to follow its terrible instinct to hide inside the home of its family. But once inside the attic or the room of the chickens outside, the vampire, so close to their loved ones, remembered their humanity and refused to feed. So it sat onto its knees and pleaded to the Holy Mother and prayed as its hunger destroyed it, wasting away to nothing. And once all strength in the body was lost, and it fell apart like dust, the miserable soul of the vampire would throw itself before Mary and God in repentance, and would be taken away by either the Father or the devil. So in time, the family would find bones or dust inside of the home, with no understanding of how they arrived there, and they would be taken outside and put to soil, often without even realizing the proper grave in the graveyard had been left abandoned. In other cases, this salvation from the vampiric body could come from prayer books and the prayers inside the coffin or graveyard. To other Wampiry, that wicked hunger was so ravenous that the death of the family could not satiate it. So the vampire, emerging from the family home in the wake of its terrible murders, would set out just before dawn on a pilgrimage towards the town center, drawn to the church's bell tower. And if it managed to climb the bell tower and to ring the bells inside, the music of the bells would cast its spell across the entire village and damn them. From here could be no return, and everybody would die and be consumed. And so, superstition says, from time to time, entire valleys had been slaughtered by the vampire. Notably, this magic inverses the usual trope. In the spring, the black demons of winter are frightened away to the afterlife with the ringing of bells and cracking of whips, leading up to the sounding of the church bell. But by rising its magic over music, beyond that of most black demons, and reversing bells to spread its own curse, the vampire retains its ancient status as a nature spirit, a type of minor deity like the goddess hags. Their powers are simply beyond any human witcher, with some notable exceptions as always. But despite their mighty power of will, the third classic folkloric motif is that of the witcher, the foolish necromancer, who tries to raise the vampire and bewitch it to serve them. Most iconic are tales of the pipers, who learned magic songs on their recorders, which seemed to reverse the musical magic of the vampire and compel them to follow the motions of the song as if notes were strings on a puppet, dragging the vampire to act the way the song commanded. But always, in every instance, this was tragic hubris. Made into slaves, the Wampiry still possessed their own hungers and will, so as soon as the witcher fumbled a single note or missed a single line of his incantations, the control was broken, the slaughter too terrible to elaborate on. So here I first planned to retell vampire stories in their entirety, but I quickly found that would be a bit excessive. So instead, you can expect a semi-part 2 for this later this year. Instead, we'll finish this video by discussing a handful of the most major or iconic methods of detecting vampiri and of destroying their bodies to end their terrible hunt. but only a few, as these customs would especially vary drastically between villages, are seldom preserved academically since they were outlawed repeatedly, and are taught orally in much the same way as the magics of incantations or curses, which I feel are inappropriate to teach to just anybody on a YouTube channel due to their extreme potential to be mistreated or exploited. So I'll focus on the most well-known and publicized customs. But first, if you're enjoying this, you can help make these videos higher quality. I know my speech impediment can make it difficult to tell what I'm saying, and when I have to alter words to manage to say them, it can get a bit confusing. The end narration is about the best it can be. I record for several hours and take several takes to curate the best. The physical deformity just goes brr. So I'm considering hiring extra narrators for some of these videos, and if you like that idea, then consider heading over to Patreon and letting me know that you want to donate to narration specifically. You can also join the Discord if you're interested in applying to be a narrator. These videos are expensive to make due to academic paywalling, so a generous thank you to our patrons who enable my ongoing glorified info dumping. If the people of a family or village discovered they were plagued by the Vampyr, only one measure could surely save them. Since Wampiry leech power and presence among the living through the corpse they inhabit, the black soul would need to be severed from that body to remove its tie to the physical. But for this work to be done, the body would need to be found while the Vampyr rested, as hunting the demon while it roamed with full strength was possible, but immensely more dangerous, with some exception, as always. In much Eastern European superstition, the mirror has the ability to dispel illusions and magic, to show demons which otherwise can make themselves invisible, also revealing ghosts or dead souls and all manners of spirits. So if the Vampyr was using illusion to hide its corpsely bloat, the mirror reveals the true self and reality of the soul, and if the demonic soul is wandering from body like an invisible ghost, it will be seen through the mirror. So, a mirror, often carried by a pure-hearted youth who sometimes sat atop a blessed white horse, would go through the town or countryside in search of the wandering Vampyr, and if it was seen, it would be followed back to the house or grave which it rested in, and having identified either the exact location or at least the rough proximity of the Vampyr, the people would prepare for the hunt and the destruction, protecting themselves with holy aspen wood and birch branches, instruments of iron, holy crosses. If the Vampyr rested in a graveyard, the people would enter it as it rested and exhume the body. And from here, while the exact procedure varied, generally if the situation was less catastrophic, the people would prefer not to totally destroy the body, so instead they would opt to incapacitate it. And I'll also highlight that many of these customs overlap with some of the preventative customs taken in the events where the Vampyr was identified as dormant within a person before they died. And the most reliable first step would be burying the body upside down, so that when the Vampyr seized the corpse, it would begin instinctually digging straight out, but only dig itself further and further down into the ground, its hunger so ravenous that it might simply fixate on biting into the earth. Some would be buried under stones, either an entire boulder placed over the grave, or at least heavy stones placed over the chest, and perhaps the neck or head. Sometimes the corpse would be bound, their hands and legs tied in cooperation with such weights. And if an entire field of stones seemed insufficient in suppressing the Vampyr, then the next step was to pierce and deform the body. Most often either a spike of iron, the holiest of metals, or a wooden branch of either linden, aspen, oak, or even hawthorn, the holiest of trees, would be driven through the skull and major organs of the Vampyr. And contrary to many Western tropes, this absolutely would not destroy the demon, but it would trap it in place, allowing it to burn out the energy it possessed, forcing the corpse to be drained of all it had, and for the demon to give up and move on. Smaller such spikes might be driven through the tongue or mouth of the vampyr or through its jaw to prevent it from being able to feed, or a large stone might be bound within the mouth, especially beneath the tongue. In interest of the same philosophy, the major tendons and ligaments of the legs could be cut to prevent the creature from rising again. Likewise, there was often a rich and complicated series of traps and ties placed at the top of the coffin, complicated and knotting, interconnected ropes and chains. These things held a power over the magic of the vampire, and it would be compelled to need to untie every last knot before it was allowed to move past. But if even all this was feared to be insufficient against the particular haunt, then the people would turn to the resort of decapitation. The slightly riskier approach would be leaving a sickle or scythe just over the neck, so if the vampire attempted to rise, it would decapitate itself. But in the most dire situations, the people would decapitate it themselves. Once the head was removed, it was placed tied between the legs. Totally disoriented and blind, it would not be able to place the head on the body. Thus its power would be broken, dispelled. It would not find its coordination and hopefully would not be able to rise. Though even this had its limits, and there are vampire stories where despite being decapitated, the demon rises and wanders the countryside carrying its head in its hand like a lantern, though as striking a visual as the leaving of the sickle to decapitate the demon may be, it is only mentioned as one of many resorts because it was absolutely not exclusive to the vampire, but to essentially any form of undead. Again, there are the spirits whose names sometimes apply to the vampire-like, but which can also apply to totally different spirits, which still could be dealt with through these means. So again, we echo the urge of caution from Polish scholars that often Western scholars see a sickle burial and they assume that it is a vampire, but it is not adequate information to determine such things. If all else had already failed and options were running low, the destruction of the body was necessary, and where it was feasible, this was typically accomplished either with the total and absolute crushing of the body with a boulder, flattening it beyond function, or through the burning of the body in holy fire, the sacred cleansing of the fire both burning the demon away and purifying the human soul to be able to move on. With so many forms and so many names, notorious for having stalked countless villages through countless centuries, today the vampire still resides in its nook in the folk religion of Poland and of the Slavs, but very unfortunately is also chronically misunderstood. Not a cartoon creature which turns into a bat, or any romantic scoundrel to fall in love with, a mainstay of cosmology, perhaps an embodiment of grief or tragedy themselves. To know the vampire is to know the pinnacle of sorrow. This video began being written about 2 or 3 months ago, after I watched 2 very different films. From the outside, a simply unfamiliar viewer might assume both to be somewhat accurate or original Eastern European vampire stories, since both begin at least in Eastern Europe. One somewhat vague, and the other specifically the Romanian Carpathians. One film, a loose adaptation of a classic Slavic novel by French filmmakers, absolutely shocked me with its delicate care and respect for folkloric accuracy. The spirit in the film was, I would say, 75 to 85% accurate to its folkloric source. Great care was taken in every step of the story, from the demon's creation to the core pain as it feeds upon family bonds, to the methods finally taken to destroy it. Such a surprisingly good film that it has repeatedly served as background footage in this video. While the second film, the recent remake of the black and white Nosferatu, features a village which seeks to destroy such a demon near the beginning of the film, and this sequence, directly pulled from historiographic accounts, is mostly solid. Likewise, the Slavic sailor who attempts to destroy the demon aboard the ship is mostly appropriate. I even smiled when the sailors shouted that the demon Dort had cursed their voyage. But as soon as Count Olaf arrived in Germany, the entire premise that he could be considered a folkloric spirit quickly fell apart. fumbling from a passing grade into absolute modern nonsense. But as I watched both films with a German and an American friend, I realized that from the outside it probably wasn't clear just how surprisingly good the first film was about folklore, and then just how terribly the second treated it. So this all lit a fire in my heart to make a beginner's reference that can at least be better than Nosferatu. I hope this video suffices for a while we finish a few of these larger projects so we can get back to Wampiry to recount a few of their stories in full and hopefully do them justice.